our thoughts are not important. Yours are the thoughts that count. Lord, help us to understand your way. Help us to defend your way. Help us to explain your way to other people in the way that your Son would want us to do that, because we want to honor and glorify you, Lord. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. If we can get this set up, we'll work on, we'll put the slides up. Let me just say about this that, again, like I mentioned last night to people, that I got involved with this totally by accident. I was trying to define adultery and found out that the definition of it in the Old Testament was not as I expected it to be. And the only way that I could explain it honestly was to say that God intentionally did not give Merriam-Webster's definition of adultery. And that, in a way, didn't shock me, because I had always been brought up to believe that God winked at polygyny in the Old Testament. And therefore, you know, it just was took to the New Testament to get it. But when I wrote the book, I started in Genesis and started going through. And when I got to that point, I was very much concerned with harmony in the Scriptures. And so I said, you know, if God permitted it there, especially if He worked it into the definition so that it was permissible, then do I really think that God is going to change the rules of marriage halfway down the historical pike? I couldn't imagine that He would do that. And so I came to Jesus, and suddenly things made sense that I had never been able to understand before, because I began to come at it from an Old Testament way of looking at it. And not from jamming my culture into Jesus, which is what often happens. Well, being the kind of person I am, I always try to anticipate arguments against me. So I want to cover everything. It's my legal background, I guess, is that you want to do that. You want to anticipate that. So I tried to do that. I tried to think of every conceivable argument that people would give against me and put it in there. Now, I was just new at it, so I didn't do as good as I could have, because I didn't know what rascals don't believe in polygyny. I didn't realize the degree to which people will go to avoid the obvious. And even when I wrote my book, I didn't realize that. And recently, from conversations with folk in biblical families, what happened is that I was directed to a chapter, a book, on the Old Testament's view of sex, written by Richard Davidson from Andrews Seminary, Andrews University in Michigan. And I had thought that, except for my old professor, Walt Kaiser, that all Old Testament professors were willing to admit that polygyny was morally permissible in the Old Testament. But when I read this book article, the second chapter, I mean, it just totally blew me away, because I looked at it and I said, this stuff is so horrible that if I were a teacher, and this were an undergraduate student, I would have failed him for this chapter. And if it were a graduate student, I would have appeared at his doctoral interrogation and insisted that he go back and take remedial hermeneutics, which is the science of studying the Bible, before we allow him to graduate. Because this stuff is just awful. One collection of logical fallacy after another, and presented as scholarly work. But that's what you're going to find in a lot of this. I don't know if we can get that, if we're still able to get it up, probably not. I don't know. We're going to do it. There are a number of passages. What I'd like to do with the first one here is talk about what are the kinds of passages that you will hear from people where they are going to try and prove that polygyny is wrong. What's their best case? Well, there's some place where we have to start. And where we have to start is burden of proof. Who has the burden of proof with regard to the subject of is polygyny acceptable to God? Now, if you don't get that straight, they'll pull all kinds of things on you that they shouldn't be able to do. The fact is that law, as law teaches us, the person who lays a charge is the person who has the obligation to prove his case. Like a prosecutor who lays a charge against someone must prove the case, not the defense attorney. Now I know we're talking about in somewhat negative language here, but we're not saying that polygyny is something that God requires. We're saying that it's a practice. We see it in the text. They started doing it. And if somebody comes along and says that that is immoral, that's laying a charge. They have the burden of proof, not you. Now there are different levels of burden of proof. You know, all the way from more often than not, you know, all the way up to without any reasonable doubt, beyond reasonable doubt. And if you're going to tell somebody that they are guilty of an offense, very much like adultery, you better be able to get the highest level of that in favor of what you say. Well, let's see if they can do it. They start with Genesis 2:24. You know, the passage where the two shall become one flesh. You know the story. I don't need to repeat all of that, but the idea is that God created man by himself. He is now faced with feeling inadequate. It's not good for man to be alone. Did God make a mistake? No, he wanted to make a point. And the point is that it's not good for man to be alone. Having made that point, he then brings animals to it. And feeling lonely, Adam looks at all these animals and gives them all names and says, you know, that's not for me, that's a lion. That's not for me, that's a zebra, or whatever he said. But he recognized that this was not compatible to him. They were a different flesh from him. So God puts him to sleep and takes a rib out and creates a woman out of it and brings it to him, and kind of freely translated from the Hebrew, he said, wow, this is the one. He knew that she was bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. She looked like him. She was like him. She was the appropriate, compatible partner. And so the text then says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Now that's the text that's repeated in the New Testament on a number of occasions. In Matthew 19, I think it's in Mark 10, but anyway, Matthew 19 for sure, and then you've got it in Ephesians, about Christ in the church, you've got it in 1 Corinthians, when Paul's talking about prostitutes, men with prostitutes, so it's repeated a number of times in the New Testament. Now, what was going on in that passage? What is it really saying? Because now we start moving into all kinds of imaginative interpretations of what one flesh means. And those end up, many times, denying that polygyny is permissible. For example, they will say, well, you know, it's a spiritual union, it's an intimate union, and you can only have that with one person. Really? It's just like one flesh. I used to say, really, if you think that is true, my head controls all of my fingers. I've got multiple fingers, and I think my head has got a one-flesh relationship to each of my fingers. Are you telling me I can only have one finger? It's a spiritual union. You get all these different things. It's a spiritual, really, it's a spiritual union? Where's your basis for that? You know, and if it's a spiritual union, wouldn't they be together forever in eternity? But Jesus said it was only for time. So there are different things like that are said, but what it really is saying is, the text is saying, for this reason, for the reason that he recognizes her compatibility to him, that she fits him, he is going to leave his father and mother. And when we talk about cleaving, you cannot understand cleaving unless you understand leaving. And of course, Adam had no father or mother. Thank you. He had no father or mother. God was his father. But he didn't have any. So, what does it mean? Why is that important? Why does Moses put into the text at that point an editorial comment about what happens later? Well, if you listen to the anti-polygynists, what they will say is, that proves that this is an ideal standard that has got to be followed from here on out. Well, you know, what it tells me is that there are other circumstances that happened after the garden that we need to take into account, is what it tells me. Yes?
I always like to make the argument at that point, or really a rhetorical question, why did the Jews in all of their history never draw that inference?
Yeah, that, they were stupid apparently. They didn't understand Hebrew. That must have been it. Of course, we know Hebrew was spoken in the garden. That's what my Jewish friends tell me. So what it's saying is that he will leave the relationship with his parents. I used to make a really huge thing out of that by saying that means that he leaves off his dependency to his parents and takes on responsibility for his wife. And I think there's truth to that. But I think there's another point. His father and mother have their own compatibility relationship, and he is kind of hanging in there as a child. But as soon as he gets to the point where he can establish his own compatibility relationship, he is going to leave that relationship because that also is not satisfying for what he needs. So he will now cleave to his wife. And just as he could leave his parents with the intention of never going back and being a child again, he will now cleave to his wife and never intend to let that end. So when you get all these imaginative things like cleave means glue. And you get all these it's just like the leprosy that adhered to Gehazi's flesh, because the word is used there. And all that sort of thing. And you say, or two pieces of dirt that meld together in the rain. And they say, that's exactly how it is. You cannot separate it. You cannot sunder it. Well, this isn't on divorce, but, my point was, well, then why does Jesus say you shouldn't? You don't usually tell people they can't do, or they shouldn't do what they can't do. So apparently you can, but you shouldn't. You can't move from the is to the ought very well, and often that's what happens with this Genesis passage. They try to take the Genesis passage and say, this is what you can infer from it. One man, one woman for life. And then they realize they can't say that. Why not? Anybody know why you can't say one man, one woman for life?
Because that is a marriage, but they didn't say, and a man may not contract more than one such marriage.
And there's a particular biblical passage where it absolutely goes against that. It's in the New Testament by Paul. He's writing about widows. And he says, young widows, I require to get married again. Well, wait a minute. I hear John MacArthur on his program Grace to You talking about divorce remarriage, and he made this big point. I thought it sounded really nice, but it was dumb. He said, look, God didn't create Adam and Eve with spare parts. You ever heard that? If you have another wife that you bring into it, that's a spare part. Well, where did the spare part come from the woman that was told to get married after her husband died? All I see in Genesis is one man, one woman. So if you're going to be rigorously requiring that to be literally exactly the way it is, then you should not be telling women that they can get married if they're young widows. So that one expansion right there, and in some senses I may be better off not using my notes because they're so detailed that they'll probably make me go to sleep. But anyway, that's one of the things, one of the points where you cannot draw the inference that it's one man, one woman only. But I believe that you can say that marriage is intended to be one man, one woman. Every marriage that a polygamist is involved with is one man, one woman. Every one of his marriages is that way, aren't they? When was the last time you saw the man stand up there with two wives, two brides, one man? Never. I've never seen it.
Actually, we have even one guy in Texas who did that.
You did that? See, I wouldn't like that because... Yeah, the reason why I don't like that is because a covenant is supposed to be between one man and one woman, but he can have another one man, one woman relationship. We shouldn't say polygynous marriages. We should say polygynous families. Because a polygynous marriage, I'm not even sure what that is. I guess that is one man with two wives, and it's one covenant between all three of them. One covenant with all three? That's not the way
That's more the Mormon concept where in Big Love, where they talk about she's married to us. They use that terminology. We definitely don't use that terminology.
Yeah, that's why we should always go with that. It's a polygynous family. And and each marriage is one man, one woman. So certain things that you can take logically from it and other things that you can't. And to say that that means that you can't have that fails to take into account the fact that sin occurred. Because sin occurred, death occurred. Because death occurs, widows need to be remarried if they're young, as Paul says in 1 Timothy. What other implications are there because of sin? Well, disease. Because of disease, people die. You're also incapacitated. You also have wrong ways of working out your sexual drive. Right or wrong ways to do it. I assume it's all related to the fall. But we live in the post-fall world. We don't live back then. We live now. And there isn't any particular reason why you can tell me if you can allow a widow to get remarried, that is, have consecutive marriages, why you can argue that somebody couldn't have concurrent ones for the man. Why do we say that a woman can't have concurrent marriages?
It's a violation of the hierarchy of marriage.
Absolutely right, because in Genesis, though people don't like to make a big thing of it these days, there's so many that want to have egalitarian marriages, what you have is God bringing the animals to him, and he names them, and it shows his superiority over them. He brings Eve to him, and he names Eve. Beside the fact that you've got Paul saying she was created for him, and other such things. So yes, it's a hierarchy. It's a patriarchal approach. No embarrassment about that. I don't know why there's so many people embarrassed about it these days, but to me, that's the basic here. If I were giving any advice as an outsider to your group, I would say, pull that logo off your website where you've got one man with two women and children on either side, and stress patriarchy. Because if you stress patriarchy, you're going to get a bunch of evangelicals who are going to agree with you and jump on board, and then let them know when they get in there that it's a distinctive of the group, not right up on the top.
That's good. What does the logo for patriarchy look like?
I don't know, man, with a long beard. I don't know. I haven't thought of that part of it. But I did say to Keith that I thought that that would be the best thing for you, because then you're going to get a lot of people on your side. And as we know, that's one of the basic reasons why polygyny makes sense, is because patriarchy makes sense. And some people got that all fouled up. But that's the first thing you're going to do, is you're going to run into people that are going to go to Genesis 2:24. If you make it clear that they have the burden of proof, they have to prove that because God created one woman for one man, that was all that they get, and that there are no spare parts. Now, does anybody know why God created only one woman for Adam?
I have a speculation.
Okay.
Partly for it all ultimately comes down to salvation and redemption being in mind, but the unity of the human race would be involved. Say, for example, Adam and Eve sinned, but the other wife that was given to them never sinned. You'd have a very odd situation here. So I think part of it is for the unity of the human race.
Yeah, well, that creates another problem too, as you think about it, because what happens if Adam hadn't sinned?
And Eve did.
And Eve did. Would God have created another wife for him?
Maybe.
Ooh.
And some of the Jews say he did.
Lilith, yeah. Now here's Keith said that the reason why he thought it was that God was starting small to work big. If he did okay with one wife, he would have given him two. There could be something to that. I think that if God was really didn't have something else in mind, he would have given him like 100 wives. Because after all, the main thing he told him to do was be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and you can certainly do that better with 100 wives than you can with one. But I think, I'll tell you what the reason why I think this was. And I don't know why I thought of this, but this kind of hit me the other day. The answer to it, I believe, is in Genesis 22. What's going on in Genesis 22? Anybody know what's happening in Genesis 22? It's a story of Abraham and Isaac. Think about that story very carefully. God promised Abraham a son. He said, Sarah's too old. I've got Hagar. Let Ishmael be before thee, O Lord. But God said, no, it's going to be through Sarah's son, it's going to be through Isaac. So just in 21, that's in my 16, 17, in 21, Hagar leaves and takes Ishmael with her. Abraham has now got an aged wife who had a miracle baby. And God says to him, take your son, your only son, and sacrifice him. What was the test? The test is, it's me or the one that you have now put all your hopes in. There's something about the dynamic of that test for Abraham that required that he have only one son to fulfill it, and that one son could be taken away from him. Now take it back to Adam in the garden. He knew that he couldn't be alone. And God gave him that one wife. And she sinned. And now he's faced with losing the one person that God gave him that satisfies his need. There is something different about the dynamic of a test. If you've got two options, one you can let go. But if you've only got one option, and now notice the difference between Abraham and Adam. Because of Adam's decision to go with the one that God had given him, rather than God, to count on God to make it up somehow, all of the human race fell into sin and damnation. With Abraham, it's just the opposite. Because he chose to agree to God, it was counted to him as righteousness, and all nations will be blessed in you. Abraham is the counterpart to Adam. What Adam failed in his test and didn't get the blessing, Abraham passed his test and did get the blessing. I think it's that God was setting up that test. He wasn't surprised that he sinned. God wasn't surprised. He knew it was going to happen, and he knew that that was the test for Adam. Not eating of the tree. That wasn't Adam's real test. Adam's real test is, are you going to go with Eve, or are you going to go with me?
Exactly.
And if you have two wives, that just messes that whole dynamic up. Somebody had...
Yeah, basically he chose relationship with his human counterpart over relationship with God and obedience to God. Because obedience is a big deal, and if he worshipped him and trusted him completely, he would have obeyed him. But here he was choosing relationship. That's what happens with people in churches. People a lot of times choose to stay in a church knowing that they have bad doctrine, or because that's where all their friends are, that's where their family is, and all that. And they choose relationship over obedience to God.
I studied at a liberal seminary. I was at McCormick Seminary, and we studied liberal theologians, modern theologians, and one of them we studied was Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich, I can't say so much for Paul, but one thing he said that was really, really very good. He said, God is your ultimate regard. Whatever is your ultimate regard is God to you. It can be math. It can be a human being. I always tell my students it can be an I doll, a he doll, a she doll. There's all kinds of idols. For Adam, Eve became his idol. And notice how quick he went against that idol once he had to pay the penalty for it.
That's right.
And he blamed her.
I hadn't never heard it articulated like that before, but it makes total sense to me, because when the Lord decided to kind of dish out the consequences, the first reason he gave to Adam for what he was going to punish Adam with was because he hearkened to her, to Eve.
Yeah. You see the translation in the NET? It's very interesting. It says, because you obeyed your wife.
Wow.
You know, we usually say because you listened to your wife. But the meaning of it in that context is because you listened to what she told you to do, because you obeyed your wife, I will curse the ground because of you. And then Eve, she decides, he says, you are going to desire to control him, but he is going to dominate you. Battle of the sexes, right there. God knew it. There it was. You know, but okay, well, that's one of the key verses you're going to hear. They're going to run to Genesis 2:24. They're going to argue that, oh, you can only have intimacy with two people. Say, you know that personally. You know, just a man and a woman. You know that personally. I know people who practice polygyny and they don't agree with that. Neither do either of the wives of the man. You know, I have an intimate relationship, as I said before, with each of my fingers. You know, I have an intimate relationship with all three of my children. That's another good way to come at it with them, is to say, are you telling me that I can't have a loving, intimate relationship with more than one person? I have that with my children. Are you telling me I can't have that with a wife? Why not? Is it because you've got some sort of a weird understanding of one flesh that you've gotten built in from the traditions that have elevated that to some mystical kind of a thing? That's not mystical in the Bible. One flesh, you know, she's the same kind of flesh that I am, unlike the animals. That's where that comes from. And now in the sex that they have, the one body relationship they have, those two sundered parts of flesh are put together again as closely as they can be. But you mean to tell me that God couldn't have taken out another, rib and made up another woman? He couldn't have likewise been unified with her? I mean, I just don't see what the logic is for it. And they don't know it either. And if you call them on it, you probably get fairly good results. They just kind of stand there and hem and haw. But that's one of the things. You'll see that, and then they'll go to the New Testament and deal with some other things there, and I'm just not going to go into that because we don't have time. But that's one of the main passages. There are actually three basic areas that you're going to get. One area is going to be that, Genesis 2:24, and its repetition in the New Testament. He'll tell you, David or God, Christ has a relationship with the church. Not two churches, just one church. Yeah, but that's because God's relationship to the church is like a man's relationship to his family. God's relationship to the individual with the engagement ring of the Holy Spirit for each individual person, Ephesians, is many people.
Yeah, something else about the church. The church is not a proper name. The church is just a group of people that love God, that have a common love for God. It's not a proper name. It's never used in a proper name.
Yeah, it's a corporate entity. It's where two or three are gathered together in my name. There I am. That's the church that constitutes the church.
A lot of people want to make it into a proper name and into a thing unto itself, and it's just a loose term defining believers that have God in common.
So that's one area that they're going to go to right away. And what I've got with this, we're going to put these up. I will put the whole thing up, but like I say, it's so complicated. If I went through the slide presentation, you'd probably, some of you would be sleeping, others would be getting, their stomach would be upset, and so forth. So I'm not going to do that. Okay, that's one. What's the next one that they're going to do? They're going to take you to the law. They're going to take you to Leviticus 18:18. Now, this is a dumb passage for them to go to, but they will go to it. And it's an important passage to them, and so they will stand on their head to make this passage say that God is opposed to multiple marriages. And what the text says is that a man shall not take a sister to a woman to her sister, to make her to be her rival while her first wife is living. Now, you would not believe the effort that Davidson goes to try and prove that simply means a woman to another woman. He goes into the Hebrew, he goes into the context, and the Hebrew and the context and all this stuff, and it's just like kind of like I've heard say, there's no lie like a good detailed lie. None of his arguments, he got 8 of them, none of them hold any water. None of them do. But if you didn't know Hebrew and you didn't know what was going on, you'd say, wow, this guy really knows what he's talking about. No, he doesn't. But he can make it look really, really good. What he tries to say, among other things, is this. Verse 18, about the woman and her sister, are different in their form from the incest passages that precede it. Don't expose the nakedness of this woman, that woman, the other woman, because that's the nakedness of somebody. and so forth, all those passages. And he points out, correctly so, that verse begins a different way. And so he says that's a different section. There's a section break between the two of them. Yeah, kind of, sort of. I agree with him about that. But the whole chapter is all dealing with the same subject. So even though it's a little different, it's still in the same ballpark, and it's closer to the ones that precede it than it is to the ones that follow it. So you can get very scholarly about this, but if you're very careful with the guy, you realize that he's pulling, he's just doing the best he can to try and show that it's wrong. And what I do with the slide presentation is I take you through all 8 of his arguments, ad nauseum, and show you how all of them do not hold any water. Now, that's another value of being in a meeting like this, where you say, boy, it's starting to get into some stuff and it's over my head. I've been to some classes with teachers, and what they said was way over my head, but I knew I would be faced with those kinds of issues in the future, and I realized that I would be able to say after I left there, I don't understand what that guy is saying, but I'm not going to be moved by it, because I once sat in class with Dr. So-and-so, and he answered all of those questions. He had it all worked out, and so I'm going to trust that he understood what he was dealing with. And I think that's proper. I think it's fine if you trust the person that you're dealing with, you know what he's talking about. But if you want to go into the details, it's going to be in the slide presentation, which we'll make available to you. Yes?
Would you agree with me that when it comes to this issue, a lot of otherwise really solid logicians and good theologians suddenly are just willing to jettison all the normal interpretive rules because it's like they've got to fit this into their theology. Just on this issue, it's like it gets a free pass. It's like it's the only issue that...
Well, I studied logic, when I taught philosophy, and the work that he does in this section is so horrendous that I am aghast. I would suggest that he needs to take another, I don't know the brother. If I met him, I probably would, love him, and we'd get along well if we talked to each other about maybe another subject. But, what we have is such a huge collection of post hoc reasoning. You've got guilt by association. They will try everything to get out of the obvious. And it just astounds you as you look at this stuff. For example, they try to, my lawyer friend here will tell you that if you have a witness, like an expert witness, and he gets up and he's speaking on your behalf, and let's say he's under cross, and he says something really dumb, and it's just like, you're sitting there at your table, and you're going, oh my gosh, I don't believe he said that. Now let me tell you what happens when the court adjourns that day. Everybody goes back, all the attorneys go back, and they sit together and they powwow in the war room at the hotel, and they try to figure out how they will rehabilitate the witness, so that when they do a redirect, when they have their chance to talk to this guy again, they can pose it in such a way that he doesn't come out looking like such an idiot. That's what is going on here in a lot of this stuff. They have people that the biblical text, the narrator, the person that's being discussed, don't agree with what they thought they could get out of the guy. So they attempt to rehabilitate the text. Let me give you an example. Pretty much everybody knows that David had more than one wife. But we also know that David was said to be a man after God's own heart. So how do we put these things together? Well, what you do is you get one of your grad students to sit down and do all kinds of studies of the text and try to coordinate this happened after this, happened after that, and so therefore we can finally come up with this chart where we can show that every time that David took a wife, after that he got into some kind of trouble, there was some threat to him, and after that, and during that time he had no relationship with the Lord. And so then, when he gets back to the Lord, finally he gets to the point at the end of his life where he only takes Bathsheba and he lets all the other wives go. He returned to monogamy.
And then Mickey Mouse is king.
Pardon?
And then Mickey Mouse is king.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unbelievable. You say, oh, please. But trying to be as thorough, and I didn't even do it for this one, but I've got a book that I will make available to everybody shortly, where I take that particular chapter by Davidson. I go through every single line with him, and it's a book. My review is longer than his book, because as you know, when you're trying to show somebody who's wrong, it takes longer to correct a bad argument than it does to state it. But the fact is that it's all, this happened after that. David had no relationship to God. Well, wait a minute. It just doesn't talk about him having a relationship with God. He actually went off to war at that particular point. And it talked about the war. So all of it is just this fantastic collection of attempts to show that it is so. How do we get away with the fact that, that he only considered Bathsheba his wife? Well, there's no such basis for that at all in text. Why do we get that? Well, because the text at one point says that when David fled from Absalom, he left his wives there at the palace, and Absalom had sex with all of his wives. And so the text says he put his wives away, but we know that after that he had a relationship with Bathsheba. Now the problem with that, as my father used to say, the problem with that is it would be all right except for one thing. It's all wrong. You see, because those weren't his wives, those were his concubines. So he has to mess around with the meaning of the word wife and the word concubine and meddle with that a little bit and manipulate it to try and make it fit his point. And so then he's saying that all these wives were taken by Absalom, 10 of them. Well, we only have a list of 10 wives that David had. One of those wives was Absalom's mother. Do we really think that he had sex with his mother so that he could, deplace David? I don't think so. I think he had 10 concubines, and then he had 10 wives. And, then he must have also defiled Bathsheba, and why did he take Bathsheba back at that point? So there's all kinds of problems that you get once you start to mess with the text. And that's one thing that happens there. But that was with everybody. Moses, we're going to rehabilitate Moses. Jacob, we're going to rehabilitate Jacob. What we do with Jacob is we say, when Jacob took all these wives, he got into all kinds of trouble, but when he went to the Jabbok River and wrestled with God, after that point, did you know that he never spoke of any of the women except Rachel by using the word Isha or for wife? Never did. Well, that sounds real good till you think about it for a second. You realize that before they went to the Jabbok, right before he got there, it's not Jacob who calls these women his wives. It's the narrator. Moses calls them wives before the Jabbok. So apparently, we can now rehabilitate God and Moses as well. God realized I shouldn't have inspired him to say wives before the Jabbok, and now that we've gotten to the Jabbok, now we can say that he's not, that he only had one wife. He only considered Rachel. Of course, you got a question there as to why he would take Rachel, why David would take Bathsheba, since they were wife number 2, wife number, 8, 9, 10, whatever it is. Why didn't God make him go back to Michal for David? Of course, there's a little bit of a difference on Rachel and Leah, because he actually cut the covenant with Rachel for her and paid the price for her. So technically, she was his first wife. But he didn't complete it by consummating it. And then he went along with having to do it the second time to go the other way. So there is a question as to which one was his first wife, that sort of thing. But this is the kind of reasoning that you will run into with the scholars. Don't be moved by these people. They do not have good arguments on this material.
So in other words, if you see somebody with a bunch of letters before their name,
He's got to be good. He's got a doctorate.
it's like, oh,
That's right.
it's like a PhD. I'm afraid. Be very afraid.
Now, a second law that is involved with that is Deuteronomy 18:18. Deuteronomy 18:18 says, "Kings shall not multiply their wives." And he tries to make a good case for the fact that this is saying that a king should not have more than one wife. He runs into a little trouble in the context, however, because it also says that he should not multiply his horses and he shouldn't multiply his money. Or greatly multiply his money is the exact Hebrew. But if it says shall not multiply his horses, Do we really mean to say that David was limited to one horse? Is that what that means? No, that's not what that means. Pardon?
It means not to be greedy and pile them up.
Yeah, in that particular case, he wasn't supposed to go back to Egypt and get horses to build up his pride, and that sort of thing, but it didn't mean that he couldn't have more than one horse. And money, he had plenty of money, but he didn't have more than that. Another problem with kings is that kings can do something that the average Joe can't do. The average Joe, when he wants to get married in Israel, in ancient Israel, he has to produce a bride price. A bride price, as we were talking about last night, is kind of a heavy-duty deal because the run-of-the-mill price was 10 months' wages. To get 10 months' wages, he's got to work for probably a couple of years, 2-3 years, because he can't give over everything he makes for 10 months to the father. So he's got to eat along and live along with money as well, so he can't give him everything. He's got to give him only part of what he makes. And so 10 months becomes 2-3 years. But a king, he doesn't have to worry about it. A king has got a big, deep pocket. So if he sees women that he wants, he can just reach in and pay the money outright. He doesn't have to work it off. And that way he can just pull all kinds of women from society and make them his wives.
I'm sitting here wondering, wouldn't a king who was interested in multiplying his wives and his horses and his money be a pretty poor statesman? I mean, do you think maybe what it's saying is, do your job? Don't be distracted.
Well, actually, in that day, the king who multiplied his horses would be taking, trying to build up his army to be good. That would be a good thing for a politician. Wives were generally by kings taken for treaties to establish treaty relationships, so that would be pretty good. And of course, when the king makes a lot of money, he can build things that are helpful for people and all. So, I mean, you could argue that sort of thing, but they're right. The point is that God wants him to depend upon him rather than upon just the fact that he can pull every good-looking girl out because he has deep pockets. Or he can go down because he has money and he can, get a lot of horses. And that'll make him, like Egypt, and then he'll bring in wives and so forth. The only king that I know of that was ever condemned for multiplying his wives was Solomon, and he was a little bit indiscreet about how he did it, as we all know. Which leads us to another point, and that is the ode to monogamy. The ode to monogamy is in Proverbs chapter 5. Take water from your own cistern, should your water be spread in the streets. This is the ode to monogamy, written by the world's biggest polygynist. You really expect me to buy that? Well, he learned his lesson, and in the end, and he came back to monogamy as well. Really, that's not what the text says. When he got old, he departed from God. They led him astray. When did he write Proverbs? He wrote Proverbs in the middle of his life when he was accruing as many wives as he could. Which shows us that you can have that kind of wonderful relationship that the book of Song of Solomon talks about, written by a polygynist. But people who practice monogamy all the time, they just don't understand that. They can't see that fact at all. So you've got Leviticus 18, and even Davidson admits, the text is imprecise. Blame the text for not being able to make your point from it. That's just all. So you've got the legal section like that. You've got Genesis, you've got the legal section, and then you've got, of course, Timothy and Titus. That's the next place that they will go. Oh, they may also pass by as they go. They'll pass by Jesus' comment, they two shall become one flesh. He didn't say they three shall become one flesh. He said they two shall become one flesh. I dealt with that in the problem of divorce and remarriage. And what my point was is that the only people that interpreted the Genesis passage in that way were the Essenes. These were this radical group that were out in the desert, and they took that passage and turned it into an anti-polygyny passage. Now let's take a look at the rest of society, including Jesus. He is not doing that with that passage. Incidentally, the word two isn't even in the Hebrew text. It's only in the Septuagint. That's no problem. I have no problem with being they two shall become one flesh. It is they two shall become one flesh. So, but what is Jesus doing with it? What Jesus is saying in that part of his involvement with the Pharisees is, you think that it's all right for you as men to unilaterally end your marriage relationship with a woman that you became one flesh with. But I'm saying that if you do that, God is going to hold you responsible for adultery. So the problem isn't they two as opposed to they three. It's the question of they one now wanting to become they two. Or one of they one becoming two again. Separated. Has nothing to do with the number of wives getting married, and everything that you can say that the monogamists who insist upon it will say to you, everything that they say is true of each individual marriage that a polygamist enters into. You can have all those wonderful things in Song of Solomon. You can have all the statements of Jesus, that a man cannot unilaterally end his marriage relationship. All of those things are true with regard to polygyny and every marriage within polygyny. They've got a category mistake going on in confusing the marriage with the family. So those are the Old Testament passages and Jesus, which we sometimes lump with the Old Testament. And then you've got the passage by Paul. The passage by Paul is as you may remember, it's saying that deacons and elders should be the husband of one wife. Now, what could be more obvious, they say to you, than that passage? Obviously, you can't have more than one wife. It says he should be the husband of one wife. Well, there's some problems with that interpretation. The first problem is that would be very much like my telling my friend Erwin Lutzer at Moody Church in Chicago, if he wrote me a letter and said, what should I make as deacons or elders? And I said to him, well, the first thing you should do is you shouldn't take any Indian maidens that have a certain amount of necklace on them to be your wife. Or putting it another way, I hate to do this because there is a negative connotation. It would be like my saying to Erwin, be sure the first thing about deacons and elders is you don't accept anybody who's a cannibal. And he would say, well, I agree with that, but nobody's practiced cannibalism around here for as far as anybody can remember. The same thing is true in Ephesus and Crete, where Timothy and Titus were. Nobody had practiced polygamy in Ephesus or Crete for 400 years. So why would Paul condemn something that nobody was practicing? It just doesn't make any sense. There are some other reasons. What was the number one problem in Greece for men? Does anybody know? What was it?
Prostitution.
Prostitution, fornication. That's the problem. If you're condemning polygamy, which is two marital relations that a man has, you haven't said anything about fornication, really. Why would he ignore the thing that was practiced all the time and bring up something that nobody was practicing? Maybe that should make me rethink what possibly could be being said here. Okay, let me give you some other reasons. I like this one. Do you really mean to tell me that Abraham and David, Abraham is the father of all the faithful and David's going to reign with Christ in the millennium, that they couldn't even take a gift of food to a widow in the church? Really? I don't believe that. But I'll tell you one of the best reasons for why you shouldn't accept that interpretation, and that is that qualifications passages by their nature do not introduce new teaching. They summarize old teaching. If it weren't that case, you wouldn't necessarily have anybody who would qualify. You've got to go to the pool and say, who are the people who are following the rules? Here are the rules that have to be for deacons and elders, and it presupposes that you've got teaching that told them that they should do all the different things in the qualifications. So where's your passage that precedes the pastoral epistles that condemns polygyny? Find it for me. You won't find it. But what you will find in 1 Corinthians is a passage like this, 7, 1 and 2. To avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. Paul's writing to a monogamous society, sort of, kind of. I mean, every Greek man had his wife for his children, his mistress for his romance, and the prostitutes when he was feeling, hot under the collar, he would go. In Rome, it was a little different. They had wives for their children, and they had mistresses as well. They weren't so big on prostitutes over there as they were over in Greece, but that was there. And none of them had any covenants with anybody but their wife. So they could say, we're monogamists. Yeah, they're monogamous like most American, a lot of American men are monogamous. They're not polygynous. They would never be like you guys. But, if I can't get it at home, I'll go out and get it somewhere else. Churches will condemn you for polygyny, but how often do they really take on the people that they know are living with somebody else or that is a known fornicator? It's like the Church of Corinth. They ignore the obvious, the real biggies, in favor of other things. Let them go. They're good paying members or whatever. I don't know. Anyway.
Or in that case, they'll say churches for the hurting or churches for the sinners will help them.
Yeah. So what you've got is the fact that Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 7:2, he's saying, let every man have his own wife and every woman have her own husband, because in a monogamous society, she can't do what she was told in the Old Testament or what she wasn't told to do. She wasn't told in the Old Testament she had to have sex with her husband at all. He was told he had to have sex with her, primarily for children, because she inherited in that way, was cared for in that way. But as far as he's concerned, or she's concerned, she was not required to have sex with him. But Paul says, I'm going to make a concession here, and it's a concession for a monogamous society. I'm going to say she can't keep herself from her husband. Well, let me say a word about own, because that comes up. Well, if it's her own husband, and she has the rights over his body, how can he give his body to another woman? Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's a different type of own, right?
It's a different type of own. A different word is used. The word for the husband is a pronoun, a reflexive pronoun, which is like himself. She is a part of himself. He owns her as if she were a part of himself. But the word used for her is the same word that's used for Jesus when he went to Capernaum, which was his own city. Does that mean that he was the only person who could live in that city? It was his own city. So what we have in the 1 Corinthians passage is a statement against fornication to a monogamous readership. And now when we come to the Timothy and Titus passage, you have just a kind of a flipping of the terminology, where it's saying he shouldn't be an any woman kind of man, a many woman kind of man. He should be a one woman kind of man, because after all, you're monogamous, so if you have a woman, it's going to be one. So it's kind of the counterpart of he's not going to be a many woman kind of man. There's another reason for this, and that is what passage we mentioned earlier, and that is about the widow. The widow is told, he's talking about widows, and Paul says, take on as a widow only those who are widows indeed. A woman who has been the wife of one husband. It's exactly the same concept, but the genders are reversed. So you're not supposed to have, so the only people that can be put on the till for the church, for them, for their payment, is if a woman who has only been the wife of one husband. But then he goes on to say, if it's a young widow, I say she should get married. Now wait a minute. What happens if she marries this other guy and he dies? Is she now going to be penalized so that she can no longer be put on the list for the church because she took Paul's advice? That's why we say, no, what that is saying when it says she should be the wife of one husband is she shouldn't be running around with other men while she's married to him. A many-man kind of woman. Just as he shouldn't be a many-woman kind of man running around with the prostitutes. And he simply puts it that way. And that's what it means. It's condemning fornication. It's saying if you have a deacon or an elder, he should not be a fornicator. He shouldn't be practicing the way that all Greek men do. Anybody have any thoughts or questions? My train gets rolling and I just...
Yeah, I wonder what you thought about the linguistic aspects of it. J.E. Adams was a Hebrew scholar. I'm sorry, Greek scholar. And he and a few others have pointed out that the grammatical construction of the verse is a little unusual. I've done a little bit of research into the use of the word mia there, or mia for the form of the word, and one of the things I mentioned in my book, the interpretation that I lean towards, was that it's basically, he's got divorce in mind, because he's saying he should be, that word mia can be translated as first. And in other words, he should be a first wife kind of man. In other words, he should still be with his first wife. But the issue of divorce, Malachi, etc., keeps coming up over and over. It seems like it's always about faithfulness to the covenant. And
what are we going to do with Paul if Paul was divorced? Would that disqualify him because he was no longer the husband of one wife because he had a
we know
divorce?
that he was divorced.
Well, he was in the Sanhedrin, apparently. I mean, he had a position that in Jewish culture would have required him to be married. They wouldn't have considered a single man to be a Pharisee like
They
that.
may have said he was exceptional.
We're known for much exceptions.
Well, we're making this up though, but I've looked into it. I've searched that enough to see, and I'm no Greek scholar by any means, but I've checked it out enough to see that there is a similarity in the words or the form of the words, and that word is, there's definitely a relationship between the words. In John 20, verse 1, Jesus was raised on the first day of the week. That word mia is used there.
There's other issues of grammar involved with that text that are a problem. For example, there's no definite article. So,
Well, right, some people says it requires marriage.
yeah, so it's not talking about the one woman kind of man, which would mean his wife. Now, of course, Don Carson comes up and he's got the fallacy of the definite article, and he talks about that. But the book or the article that I've used the most on that is the one by Robert Sose from Talbot Seminary. He wrote an article called The Husband of One Wife. And he analyzes all of that stuff and just runs it all the way through. And his conclusion was that it's not talking about divorce, it's not talking about polygamy, it's talking about a fornicator. It's screening out people who are a many-woman kind of man, just as the other text talks about a many-man kind of woman. And that's what it's really dealing with.
Who was that?
Pardon? Robert Sose. Robert Sose. If you look up the article, The Husband of One Wife, just Google it.
How do you spell his last name?
S-A-U-S-E-Y. Robert Sose from Talbot Seminary.
And that may well be one of two articles I had bookmarked a while back that was basically, the important thing is here that even guys that aren't pro-polygamy can look at that and honestly say, okay, this can't really be about polygamy.
Yeah.
Where we can differ slightly in understanding of Mia. Keith is more of the should be married point of view, so
Right.
he differs from Bill even on this. It is a tough one to understand what's kind of, but it's clear when you can have guys who aren't pro-polygamy say this can't be about polygamy because of the context.
Okay. Well, I think the point that can be made there also, because of the unusualness of the grammar, is that it's hardly a proof text.
Yeah, it's odd in so many ways, as we've just been saying, that to lean everything on that is kind of a broken reed. You don't want to...
And that's the main pillar of
Yeah, that's the main
Third
thing they've
argument
got.
is third.
Of course, you've got the position of Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon and Calvin, who said that polygamy was preferable to divorce. And when Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce and couldn't get it from the Pope because the woman he wanted to divorce was the niece of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he knew that he was going to catch his lunch if he admitted to a divorce in that case, he couldn't do it. His hands were tied. The Pope couldn't do it. He would have loved to have accommodated the defender of the faith, Henry VIII, but he couldn't. And so Henry wrote to Martin Luther, what do you think about it? And Luther said, well, it's better than divorce. And Luther and Melanchthon were even more detailed about it when Philip of Hesse went through a divorce. And they wrote letters to him. And if you can say that sometimes Luther said things over the ale that he shouldn't say, You can't say that about Philip Melanchthon. Even the Roman Catholics said Philip Melanchthon is a first-rate grammarian, exegete, theologian. And he agreed with Luther on that point. And some other Lutherans did. There's a Polish Lutheran fellow that agreed with that, wrote an anonymous work on that point. Didn't keep him from getting persecuted, though, they found out.
Thanks, Bill. We're up to